Welcome to the sixth colloquium already on public interest technology presented to you by Arizona State University. My name is Katina. I'm the program chair of the new Masters of Science in Public Interest Technology, an online degree. And today, with our sponsors in the interim, the IEEE Society on the Social Implications of Technology and Arizona's Society Policy Engineering Collective at ASU, we are presenting to you the expose, Numbered Lives, Life and Death in Quantum Media. This whole colloquium was inspired by the wonderful Professor Jacqueline Wernimont, Distinguished Chair of Digital Humanities and Social Engagement at Dartmouth College. I'm intrigued to have her on the show today, and also together with Erin, Twyford, and Dr. George Mickhail. Erin heralds from the University of Wollongong and will talk to us about thanatopolitics, and George Mickhail about newspeak in an Orwellian time frame. I think what we might do now is go straight to Jackie. And I'll probably ask her to share her slides.
Yes. Looks like mine are up there now. Is that right?
Not yet, Jacqueline.
All right, let's see. How about now?
That's fantastic. We can see them, yes.
Okay, great.
So as a way of introduction, Jacqueline, I met you through Arizona State University at the Digital Humanities Lab there. I was welcomed into the community there by you and many of the other researchers that you worked with. I was very, very fortunate to learn about your work. What motivated you, first of all, to get into this space?
It's a kind of complicated story, but the short version of it is that I have a long-standing interest in how people count dead people and why we use numbers for particular things as opposed to, for example, words. I started out my training in the history of the English language and also literary history, and sort of trying to understand what numbers we're doing relative to what words do when we commemorate or even, sort of list mortality events. As I sort of went through the process of researching, it became clear to me that thinking about how we quantify human life and human death was an important part of the frame. And so that brought me to Numbered Lives.
Fascinating, your move away from ASU to Dartmouth College. I mean, this wonderful chair role that you have now, opening up a whole new set of opportunities for you. We're missing you at ASU, but we still get to collaborate and hear about your research and your progress. Tell us about what you're doing at Dartmouth.
Right. So the chair that I hold is for the Digital Humanities and Social Engagement Cluster, which is one of 10 clusters that were started by President Hanlon, sort of feature areas of strength and excellence on the Dartmouth campus, and to think about ways that those could have greater impact both within the Dartmouth community, but also in a kind of national and then international scope. And so the focus for the Digital Humanities and Social Engagement Cluster is feminist, it's anti-racist, right? We are interested in creating scholarship and spaces at communities, right? That are similarly feminist, anti-racist, and that are welcoming and affirming spaces for LGBTQIA folks, right? And we want, we sort of want issues of justice at the core of our work, right? So whether it's thinking about digital humanities as some of the traditional digital humanists have done with large text corpora, or if it's the kind of thing that I tend to do, which is sort of humanist critiques of various technical landscapes and practices. We want centering the issues of justice for Black Americans, Native Americans, people of color in the US, and then more broadly, to sort of be at the heart of that. And we want those sort of feminist, anti-racist, and queer affirming principles to be at the core of all the work that we do.
Thank you, Jackie. I think that contribution at Dartmouth is going to be huge, and they have the right person to do that in you. I don't actually know too many more human. I describe ASU as a very human place, but when I first moved there, the greatest support I had was from you, and that was physical, it was emotional, it was all of that. And so I see your role at Dartmouth as being trailblazing. Tell us a little bit about Haystack now. You're the co-director of this new group. How long has it been around for? What do you do, and what is its sort of focus?
Right. So Haystack, if people would like to go look at the website, it's hastac.org, haystack.org. Haystack was actually started about 20 years ago, I think. I'd have to go back and check the date, by Kathy Davidson and a sort of collaboratory of colleagues who were interested. So the initials stand for the Humanities, Arts, Science, Technology, Alliance, and Collaboratory. And it grew out of a moment in which people were thinking that they wanted to find ways to collaborate across disciplines, disciplinary formations, right? They wanted to also think about new models of learning and education. So my co-director, Kathy Davidson, was at Duke and is now at CUNY. She writes a lot on new models for higher ed. This is her area of expertise. And so she was sort of really at the vanguard of thinking about how can we transform higher education from what was really a 19th century model into something more appropriate for the 21st century. And so Haystack is it's a community, right? There's a website where there are 17,000 members who can post content. But rather than thinking about it just as like a kind of site where people can broadcast content, we tend to think about it as a space where people can find one another. Often the people who are working at the intersections of the humanities, arts, and sciences are a little bit lonesome in their own respective spaces, right? Especially here in the US, universities are heavily disciplined spaces. And part of what Haystack does is create virtual and real, we have an annual conference, spaces where people who sit at those intersections can gather and think productively across those boundaries.
And this is probably a discussion for another time, but dovetailing on what you're talking about, in Australia, we're seeing a move now where degrees in the humanities, students wishing to do these degrees will be charged extra, as opposed to those sort of STEM-oriented courses, allegedly because that's what we require as a society to move forward. But of course, this intersectionality you're talking about, this transdisciplinarity that we continue to see lip service to, and yet still be siloed as academics, that is another discussion. But do you believe that digital humanities will pervade, that humanities is all digital already, is becoming digital, or where do you stand in that sort of discussion?
So it's a pretty complicated debate. I certainly wouldn't want to say that all humanities are digital, right? I think for me, part of the critical purchase of whether you want to call it digital humanities or digital studies is bringing the humanistic cultural theory toolkit to bear on digital tools and digital practices, right? I think there are also, on the flip side, really interesting ways where people are leveraging digital tools, as people will say, to ask new questions, right? They're putting together corpora that are bigger than a human person can read in the course of their lifetime, for example, using machine learning, natural language programming, et cetera. I think the best versions of that are when people are using the literary texts or the cultural texts to also critique the machine, right? So that the thing that's being worked on, the content, is speaking back and pushing back against the machine, a machine that was really, to be honest, or a process that was never built with that particular thing in mind, right? And so this kind of dual critical directionality, I think, is where digital humanities is at its best. I don't think all humanities are digital just by virtue of every one of us using a computer, for example, because honestly, even I tend to use it rather instrumentally in many situations, right? Right now, I'm not really thinking too hard about this machine. But I think the best digital humanities scholarship is thinking very critically about the places where humans and culture and technology interface and sometimes clash. So I don't think it's all going to be digital. I don't think everyone needs to do digital humanities, just like I wouldn't say everyone needs to do STS, which is another, area that I'm pretty conversant in. But I do think there are some really important and valuable insights that are coming out of it that merit as much attention as some of the more traditional disciplinary formations.
I love it. We're going to be very spoiled by you. I can tell from the front page. I am intrigued by the image. I don't know if that's where you want to begin, Jacqueline, but I'm going to go on stopping my video and just listening to you intently. Can you talk to us about that picture first and then go on? Thank you.
I sure can. So I want to say thanks also, Katina, for inviting me and for folks spending some time. I know some of you are up early in the morning and wrangling children and things like that, or perhaps on the other side of the time schedule. And I just want to acknowledge that you being here to spend time with me thinking about these things is a gift. So the image in some ways illustrates the two kinds of the tale of two technologies that is my book, right? On the left-hand side, you have a woman who's got a pedometer wrapped around her ankle. She's probably at a dance competition, which is where we begin to see the first use by mostly white women in the United States of pedometers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then on the right-hand side, right, you have two soldiers standing in a large, a grave complex. And in some ways, I tend to think of military cemeteries as a kind of three-dimensional data visualization, right? They have, for me, a very potent visual field when you see, right, rolling hills of grave markers, right? It gives a kind of depth and breadth to the losses of armed conflict historically and contemporarily. And so in some ways, this stands for the two technologies and the sort of bifurcation of my book, right? One is thinking about activity tracking in human life, and the other is thinking about the practices that we use to quantify and then represent back to ourselves that quantification of human death. And, in the course of my talk, I'm going to be, let's see, which way do I advance? There we go. Part of what I'm going to be talking about is not only these two technologies, but also two modalities, right? And the first one that I want to walk us through is what I tend to sort of think of it, colloquially as abstracting away, right? How we are abstracting away from individuals, from smaller groups of people into larger aggregate collections of numbers and information. And in Numbered Lives, I do that specifically with the two technologies of the pedometer and the mortality table. And here, I just want to give you a quick sense because they're gorgeous, but also I think it helps ground the discussion in some ways. These early technologies of the pedometer and what was originally called the Waywiser had their start in 16th century Europe. That's not a thing that I knew when I began working on the book. I knew that the other technology, the mortality tables, had their sort of historical arrival moment in the 16th century. But it turns out that the pedometer also has its origins in 16th century Europe. And there's a way in which that sort of shared temporal history and also a geographic history knits together the analysis of my book. And what you have here on the left is a German 1590 pedometer, and on the right, a smaller, no, the one on the left would have been handheld or perhaps in a small box. And the one on the right would have been worn on probably a gentleman's clothing. And the little curly Q that you see there up at the top would have connected to a silk cord that would have been attached at the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And so these pedometers would have been mechanically advanced, right? So literally the action of the human body was what advanced the dials on these early pedometers. And as you can see, they're beautiful. They're gorgeous objects. They were quite expensive. They sort of fit very nicely into what historians of science describe as the kind of conspicuous consumption of early modern scientific instrument practices. And one of the things that I discovered in or learned more about as I was doing the research is that these devices were not initially about tracking human activity. they were initially about measuring land, right? And so what was going on was that the steps of the human body were sort of integrated with the mechanics of these devices, not for the purposes of measuring human activity, but instead for the purpose of literally walking the boundaries of land holdings, right? Or they would have been used by cartographers, right, who needed to measure the distance that they were traveling in a space as they were doing the map making. And so it was a historical shift that happened roughly around the Napoleonic era, right? When we begin to see the pedometer move not completely out of being a land measurement device, but sort of layering on the human activity measurement feature, right? And it's actually Napoleon's doctor had one of these self-winding pedometers attached to his patient, in part because he didn't believe that his patient was following his guidelines to take a sufficient number of steps in a day, right? So there was a way in which even the very first instances that we have in the historical record of the use of the pedometer is sort of on human bodies is wrapped up in this kind of medical surveillance system, right? But it also always has this land surveying quality to it. And I want to note that the people who would have moved these devices and their bodies across, space would have been largely white and relatively wealthy men. And I bring that up in part because one of the things that I do in my analysis is talk about the way in which these devices are part of an imperial colonial project, but also part of a gendering and what's the word that I'm looking for? It just ran away from me. Is a gendering dynamic, a gendering technology, right? So initially you have men who are wearing these devices, who are using them to track pieces of land that they themselves own. They then begin to use them for some medical surveillance purposes, but it's still largely on the bodies of men that they're worn. They come over during the colonization of the Americas, and they are used again for measuring land, but also for verifying the authenticity of certain work behaviors, things like mail delivery or train station management, or even a person who might be working a night shift on a boat or in a factory. So we begin to get a kind of complex layering of functions for the pedometer, but it remains in this relatively wealthy white male space. With the mortality bills, right, which, as I mentioned, are also a 16th century innovation, we again have a kind of, pardon me, I'm going to go back one. So I had said that it was a gendering, and the other term that I'm looking for there is racializing. I had noted that it's a mostly white male space. But one of the things that I do in the book is talk about the ways that quantification as a practice certainly was part of a racializing project around enslaved Black bodies in particular, but it was not one that used the pedometer in the same way. A different set of enumerative technologies were being used. I had someone just come in my door, which led me to a little bit of distraction. Okay, so the mortality tables, right, are my second technology in the book. And again, they're an innovation, as I said, of the 16th century. Unlike the pedometers and Waywisers, they're relatively inexpensive. They were reproduced as part of a brand new genre that we are now very familiar with, which is the newspaper. And so what you have here on the screen is a book of collected mortality bills on the right-hand side. And then in this sort of lighter inset, what you're seeing is the broadsheet style that would have been for sale for about 2 pence. It would have hung in prominent places on boards at inns or coffee houses, taverns, things like that. And it was also something that someone could buy, take home, and have as part of their own personal news document that they might then circulate amongst their friends. And the practice of collecting information, of quantifying the dead, was also a practice about sort of knowing the body of the nation, right? It was a biopolitical project that was about understanding and managing human life. But it was also, in the words of Achille Mbembe, a necropolitical project, right? It was about a way of tracking and thinking about death. And part of what Mbembe's work is so useful for me in thinking about is the ways in which, right, the biopolitics thinks about government of life, right? And necropolitics thinks about the right of the government and then its actions to allow or even ensure death of particular individuals within the state. And I draw our attention to that, right? Because the mortality bills articulate a very particular sense of who counts or who is part of the nation, particularly when we're thinking about England. They were largely, perhaps even exclusively, about white Protestant subjects. Right, you may recall, depending on how your early modern history is, right, we've had the significant schism between the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. There is now, there are separate burial spaces. Catholicism is, in many parts of England, outright outlawed. And certainly you wouldn't have had in the mortality bills, because they're counting people who were buried in Anglican parishes, you wouldn't have had any of the many, many others who are living in London and the outer boroughs of England or of London at the same time, right? So you wouldn't have had Jewish merchants who are in the center of London. You wouldn't have had folks who had come from the African continent, for example, as part of goods trade. You wouldn't have had people who were coming from an array of spaces and an array of religious backgrounds represented in these documents. Nevertheless, these documents were taken up by the English state as representing the entirety of the English nation. And I think that's really important to pay attention to. And unlike the pedometers, we do have an accounting of both men and women in the mortality bills. But here I would note, from a sort of gender analysis perspective or a gender studies perspective, that everything is rendered in a cis and binary gender model, right? Males and females. And those are the only options that are being rendered here. Which isn't to say, right, that there weren't other possibilities at the time, and in fact, other lived realities. So if this is about abstracting away, those individual mortality bills were produced weekly. They were then aggregated into monthly bills that were collected in large volumes. John Grant, who is often described as sort of the father of demography, also really important for the start of vital statistics, for something like, epidemiology, and some of the more public health oriented disciplines. Grant takes many, many years of those mortality bills and then collapses them into what he describes as his life tables. Here they're listed as casualty tables, but when he discusses them, he talks about them as life tables. And what he's doing is he's further sort of aggregating and then abstracting the numbers. And he's doing that in order to advance arguments on behalf of industries of risk management for the British state, right? So we're talking here about things like insurance. And he wants to be able to empower the British monarchy to evaluate the risk to its citizens, to be able to predict the number of both military ready individuals at any given point and the sort of growth of the population as a population management and political project. And, it's interesting to me that Grant has some complaints in his historical moment that sound very familiar today in the middle of our current epidemic, right? Where he is arguing that we can't possibly have another quarantine in the face of the plague because business can't go on, right? We can't shut everything down. And so here was a man who was aggregating the numbers of the people who were literally dying in the streets everywhere around him. And even he is arguing at the time, right, that what we need is a vision of the numbers that assures us that we can have regular commerce and business again. as with the activity tracking devices, pedometers and Waywisers, this is not just a set of practices that are Europe-centered or England-centered, right? This is part of a larger imperial project that wanted to also use the kind of local colonial dynamics to also enact colonial counts, right? So we have these mortality counts show up in the colonies in Virginia, and then they spread very widely throughout the US. They happen in island colonies. They happen in colonies distributed all around the world, where the British Imperial Project is going forward. And there's a way in which, right, what's happening in the imperial metropole is about governing the populace there, right? And what's happening in the colonial outposts is a sort of an extension of that home control, right? Send back to us the numbers so that we can judge how fruitful our colony plantings, as they often describe them, were. And again, in the colonial counts, because I'm always looking at the issue of racializing and gendering impacts for these technologies, the colonial counts are almost exclusively about the colonizers, right? They are very rarely, if ever, about the colonized. And when they are, those are set apart, right? So there's a way in which the mortality tables, which can look very much like a neutral technology, right? Just lists of people dead and the things that they died from. Those are, in fact, shaping and describing what the monarchy wants the nation to look like, what it wants its imperial holdings to look like. So this is a history that we have inherited. What you have here before you are a series of mortality reports across time. The first two on the left are from the era of the plague bills, so 16th, 17th century. The center one is 18th century US Census, when, in the case of the United States, mortality bills happened in some of the major cities. They were a civic gathering or a civic technology in the same way that they were in the UK, but with a slightly different inflection in that they tended to gather people who were buried in a variety of denominational cemeteries. So they sort of spread out, branch out, but they're not nearly as systematized as those back in the UK. Later than I would have imagined, in the 20th century, we finally get something much more like what we're familiar with today with the CDC, and the first weekly mortality reports, right? Which is on the second, the right two there are more current. The center, the middle one there, is one of the earliest MMWR reports, and then on the far right side, you have a screen cap from a very recent CDC publication. And I'll note that, for example, when the 1918 influenza struck, we didn't have anything like full enrollment of states leveraging or sending up their numbers to a central authority. So like I said, it was well into the 20th century before we had anything like a national mode for tracking mortality in the United States. So I had mentioned at the outset that this is a tale of two technologies, but it's also a tale of two methodologies. And everything that you've had thus far has been about the abstracting away. And I am personally, even though I'm deeply, deeply invested in understanding the abstracting away, right? I want to understand the way that these abstractions work, both in sort of formal technical terms, but also in social and political operations. I also want to understand what I describe as a kind of reaching towards. And part of my motivation for wanting to understand the abstracting away was that I was seeing artists in particular enact this method of reaching towards. And I'll give you an example that shows up in my book. This is the Nicholas Shadow. It's an art installation by David Gurman, and it's drawing on IraqWarBodyCount.org data, right? And Gurman, this is an incredibly powerful installation. It's in the then closed St. Ignatius Church in San Francisco. And what Gurman wanted to do with this piece was he wanted to, and he describes it this way, he wanted to collapse space and time between Americans who seemed remarkably unimpacted by the Iraq war and Iraqi civilians who were dying daily on the ground. And so what Gurman did was he connected the ongoing body counts that are part of the Iraq war body count data to this setup in San Francisco. This is a very large decommissioned bell, like that would hang in a large church. It's attached to a couple of mechanical devices and a data device and a silk string. And the bell rings every time someone dies. And, you know, people would go into the space, and the idea was that they would go in to see the installation, and there was no telling when the bell would ring, but inevitably it always rang at some point, right? Because people were very consistently dying. So it was a way of not allowing people, in this particular instance in San Francisco, to feel as if the deaths that were happening halfway across the world were not impacting them. And I was really struck by this, right? This is a deeply affecting piece. And I wanted to understand how we got to a spot where we needed something like this in order to be impacted by mortality data. And that's why I sort of talk about the reaching towards. So what I'd like to do now is take a minute and sort of enact this reaching towards with you. And as we are sort of all distributed and unable to be physically together, this isn't necessarily how I would do it if we were able to be co-present physically. I would have more than just audio. I would have tactile elements as well. But there's an audio piece here, and I want to sort of think collectively about how it's different to see these numbers on the screen than it is in another way in just a minute. So on Monday, this past Monday, 442 people in the United States were reported as having died from COVID. And I put that were reported as having died because we have every day, it seems like, new information coming out about how inaccurate our counts are, often to the point of being undercounted by as much as 2 times. So I want to specify that this is were reported. So 442 people in the US were reported as having died on Monday. 4,392 people were reported as having died from COVID globally on Monday. These are 2 screenshots of reported coronavirus deaths by day. On the left-hand side in the red is in the United States. And on the right-hand side in gray are the daily deaths globally. I'm going to give you just a minute to take a look at that. And now what I would ask you to do is to just take a moment where you are and jot down 2, 3, 5 words about how you understand and feel impacted by these 2 slides, right? Where you have the representation of the number of people who died on Monday, and you have a representation of the number of people who have died since the pandemic sort of first came on the international radar. So I'll give you just a few seconds. Now, what I'd like to do is play an extremely rudimentary sonification. Depending on how high your volume is, you may want to turn your volume down a little bit. Also, if you find that you are sort of traumatically impacted by things like sonifications of mortality data, feel free to mute for a minute. This sonification will run for a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and play it now. Okay, now I'd like to ask you to take a few moments and write down a few words reflecting on the impact of that. That sonification is a sonification of 21 of the 442 deaths on Monday. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. My apologies. That's what I wanted to do. So one of the things that I'm interested in what Luke Stark and let me find name again here real quick. Where has it gone away? Oh, Kelly Dobson have separately called data visceralization, right? Bringing data back into our bodies in some way, that reaching towards rather than abstracting away, is that it has a different kind of temporality. I think there are lots of other things that it does also, but the temporality, right? That was 1 minute for 21 lives lost on Monday. If we were going to have listened to all 442 of the reported dead in the US on Monday, it would have taken us more than 21 minutes. Obviously, that would have exceeded the time for this presentation. If we were going to listen to the 4,392 reported dead globally on Monday, it would have taken us 3.5 hours. If we were feeling particularly brave and we wanted to listen to the 225,400 reported dead in the US to date, it would have taken us 7.5 days. And it would have taken us more than 37 days if we had listened to the 125,395 reported dead globally to date. Right? There is simply a different temporality to listening to data than there is to seeing it visually. And that's something that I'm interested in. I've also been interested in thinking about different kinds of data visualizations that would allow us to think through some of these issues. On the left-hand side, you have a small grab from a project that Nikki Stevens, Christina Rose, and I put together this summer, and it's called Trace. And it essentially imagines what COVID would have been like if it had unfolded on the Dartmouth campus using actual Dartmouth data. And it plays out over a certain amount of time. On the right-hand side, you have a different example, right? There are many people who are trying to find ways to bring the numbers home, to give them some sort of impact that they just don't seem to have when they're just numbers. So on the right is from the WashingtonPost.com. It was a data visualization that visualized how big the neighborhood of the dead around you would be if everyone who had died from COVID in the United States was living in your neighborhood. And in this particular screen grab, it's from a relatively random address in New York City. I also have been watching carefully, right, the kinds of efforts by different groups and individuals to commemorate those, and I think in many ways to visualize and visceralize the dead from COVID in other ways, right? So you have these sort of stand-up memorials in various places. On the bottom right corner there, you have the 20,000 lawn chairs that were laid out facing the White House to represent the 200,000 dead. You've got another memorial project where you've got flags being placed to represent the dead. And this is a space, right, that I continue to be interested in, right? Numbered Lives as a book is and was about understanding sort of how we arrived at a moment where numbers don't seem to work, right? They don't carry the kind of informational impact or the affective impact, right? We have here in the United States a large population who's running around as if 200 plus thousand people haven't died from this disease. And so for some reason, the numbers aren't working. And it's also a spot at the same time where public health surveillance has been rendered equally as suspect as that of corporate and police surveillance. And I'm interested in understanding how that has come to be. And I think, you know, part of the answer that I get at a little bit in the book Numbered Lives, right, is that power, whether it's the power of a state, the power of a monarchy, the power of a dominant culture, it regulates through the act of quantification. And all of the technologies of quantification that participate in that are wrapped up in it. But also emotions are managed and populations are literally created through those same technologies of quantification. And I think we really need to understand more about how those powers work. And that's where I'll stop for today. Thank you.
I'd like to go to questions if that's possible. I know, Professor Wernimont, you have so much made our brain go to places location-wise and time-wise, and I want to go straight to questions. Feel free to raise your hand and make a comment online in the chat or unmute, please. Can I encourage participants to do that and just jump in? Moham, go ahead. If you'd like to unmute and show your video. Thank you.
Hi, I don't know whether you can see me, but let me just try this.
We can see you and hear you.
I'm in Mohammed. I'm actually in Melbourne, but I'm from Somalia, and this topic resonates with me because I spent some time in Mogadishu, and this issue, we look at it differently. But first of all, I just want to thank you. Really, I have no question. I'm speechless. But I just want to share with you this idea. In another life, when I was in government and I happened to be in Mexico, I never saw something I saw in Mexico where they were celebrating death. I never heard anyone celebrating death. So I asked my guest, who was the Minister of Telecommunication, and I said, look, what's this all about? I never heard of anything like this. And he said, where are you from? When I told him I was from Mogadishu, he said, look, you take death seriously, but in our case, we actually make a joke out of it. So, but after that, my perception about this whole idea, but seriously, this was really, really touching. Today I woke up trying to watch this and expecting something else about visualization and other stuff. But I just want to thank you. This is amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Toby, go ahead.
I'm trying to take my privacy sticker off. Thank you so much for this work. It's really very thought-provoking. I do work in gender-based violence, and this kind of public data visualization is a frequent thing on college campuses and things like that, with clothesline projects. And it feels very powerful. It feels like it invites people into a somber space, even in public space, to consider something that otherwise is often not talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I think one of the things, right, that I have seen when there are campus events like clotheslines, et cetera, right, is that it allows people to participate in memorializing something they themselves may know, not necessarily their own experiences, but someone around them, perhaps. It allows them to contribute, right, in ways that I think to physically do something. But I also think there's something really powerful about when I talk about this for mortality, I tend to talk about it as sitting with dead, right, sitting with our dead. But I think even in other kinds of witnessing, I think physical co-presence is a very powerful act, right? It says, I will stand here alongside you in this discomfort. I will stand here alongside you in this pain. And I think for me, that's a thing that no spreadsheet ever does. And so I find these more embodied modalities to be, I mean, perhaps part of the difference is that there's a kind of, I don't know if I want to say healing, but there's obviously something different there than simply reporting, which I feel like a spreadsheet does.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like Ali has a hand up.
Ali, thank you. Over to you. And, friends, I don't mind the silence. It's just helping us to absorb what Jacqueline has given us this morning. Go ahead, Ali.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's interesting to think about spatiality and and sort of memory making. And one of the things that came up for me is the idea of the memory palace. Are you familiar? Yeah, it's interesting. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, the idea is that there's this book that was written about this like memory contest. And the idea is that humans are inherently spatial creatures. And so in order to remember things, we mentally walk through spaces that we're really familiar with, and we'll drop memories in those spaces. So for me, that's sort of like human tendency toward spatiality as a way of experiencing the world and a way of connecting with the world seems to shine through what you've talked about. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ali. And it's, the memory palace is a tool in early modern education, right? Because they didn't have all of these devices to help remember things. And so there was a fair amount of, in like the rhetorical handbooks, et cetera, there's a fair amount of discussion of like, how do you place things in particular rooms so that they're grouped together? And I think one of the things that's so interesting about the way that you described it is that you described it as walking through. Right. And I think that's a big part of it. Right. I think even if it's an imagined body motion, right, a kind of mental construct of walking through a house, that there's something about not simply space experienced like as a two-dimensional thing, but as a three-dimensional thing, something that a body moves through and therefore remembers differently. I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Jacqueline. Thank you so much for your presentation. Really fantastic. I really, really enjoyed. And what was interesting was actually going through the examples you were doing. And I was going back to actually like Santoro, which was doing, this University of Padua in 1575, 1580s, the first measurements of physiology. Then you go further to Foucault, Souci de Soi, the selfhood. And then you see now in the last, say with digital technology, you see the quantified self. More we have big data, we have IoT, we have this entire ecosystem. We are rationalizing data, but dehumanizing data. Do you have any ideas? How can we, I understand the human need of the rationalization, it starts with, with the ideas of quantifying self to be able to, but how can we humanize data? And I would like to get your perspective on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, and I think there's a reason that it came up in your question as a kind of partner to or corollary to big data, right? Big data as an abstraction, right, it's the even bigger abstraction, right? Those mortality sheets seem tiny relative to what we think of as big data today. And I think that for me, one of the key things is that the human, my reaching towards analogy, right? When you reach towards a human, you're reaching towards something incredibly complex, right? When you're abstracting away, you're taking a small bit and you're moving it away from that complexity, right? And I think humanizing data, for me, I feel like it's got to have something to do with that complexity, right? And I'm not sure, that one of the driving forces behind big data is the ability to find information, do things with it, right? At a level that requires a fair degree of abstraction, right? So I'm not actually sure if you can have humanized big data. I do think you can have humanized little data, right? But then I think that would make the data scientists mad at me, right? And that's happened before, right? When I have said, can we have intersectional data, right? That data that is as complicated as the power that enacts, that operates over and above bodies. That's incredibly difficult. Like I'm not convinced, however big our computing powers are these days, I'm not convinced that they're big enough to actually handle the complexity of real, honest to God humans.
Thank you. And you know, I think one analogy that may help us to understand that is when we think about the virtualization process. So imagine you have a book and then you take the essence of that book and you virtualize. Now we're talking about the ontological reversal. There's actually objects from a social materiality point of view are being created first digital and then they're materializing into the physical aspects of society. And I think the moment that we take a life or a death and then you see a number, what are you doing? You're doing a process of, let's call it datization. And on that process, the complexity, if you think of all the essences that number means, it is stripped down to a very simplistic, while parsimonious for rationality. But it's really, you know, if that is a number or that's grammar, that makes a big difference, isn't it? So I think I think we need to bring those discussions to actually, you know, data visualization can be a very powerful thing, especially when you're able to spec for cognition, but trying to humanize those elements rather than, you know, making decisions. When you go and you see in decision sciences, people are saying how it can optimize an ambulance or something like that, but there is more to that. And I think those are important elements for people who are designing technology. A disclosure, yes. I'm a professor of information systems.
Yes.
So, yeah. But I think those conversations I would like to see, you know, the engineers having and the systems developers having in a way to infuse that in the systems that are being created. So thank you. Your work is great.
Yeah, thank you. And from your lips to all of their ears, I would love if they were, you know, taking seriously the need to think about some of those details.
Professor Wernimont, I just want to go to the words that people wrote when you asked us to write things down. And remember the bells. We had Diana say heartbreaking. I said awareness and unfair and inequity. Somebody else wrote inequity down. The reverse of a heartbeat, very beautiful. Somber, too frequent. It was too frequent for what we knew it was signifying. Resonant. Someone said moving, chilling, upsetting. Moving again, heartbreaking again from Nick Stevenson, who had to go. Sobering, injustice, stillness. Another person sobering again. Seeing we're feeling the same things. Very touching, Mohan wrote. There's something personal about these bells. It's not just the fact that it's a communal let's move, but it also strikes at our heart. Everyone is saying that. But is this about change? Are you calling us out to a change, Professor Wernimont? What are you? what in your heart of hearts? What does it mean to you, and what do you want us to take from this presentation, especially?
I mean, it's a big question. I don't want to live in a world in which numbers upon numbers upon numbers of people die and we see it, right? We're confronted with it all the time. And we're not driven to action, right? I don't want to live in a world in which 225,000 dead people doesn't stop you in your tracks, right? I don't want to live in a world in which 2 million migrants in the Middle East crossing a sea doesn't push people to action, right? And so I want to understand if the numbers have been leveraged in such a way that what they do is support decision systems that don't think about people, then I want to find another way, right? I want to find another way of representing those losses so that it does like literally resonate in people's bodies. I'm struck, right? Like the image that's still up on my screen is of one of the memorials, right? It's 194,938 dead at that particular moment, right? And I know for a fact that people just walk by, right? And I know why we do it. I know because we have to get up and go to work, right? We have to be with our partners. We have to take care of our animals. We have to take care of the humans in our families. And if we're shattered by it every day, then we can't function. And so I'm cognizant that we are all enacting a kind of psychological safety valve. But I worry that it's become too much a part of our culture to feel safe from those numbers. So if I'm asking for a change, it's a systematic effort to not have safe numbers.
That's fantastic. Because one of the things that happens when you meet people and they say to you, Jacqueline Wernimont, what do you do? And you're in this like thinking, will they really get what I do? Because they might think it's really macabre, or they might think, what's she really, you know, what is that what she does? In fact, these are the things that everybody should be preoccupied with every time they wake up in the morning, every single day they go to work. And at work, we don't go, oh, there's just another document to pound out. We go, actually, while we're pounding out the document, which is a strategy to A and B, we should actually be thinking about those people and how we're going to change things. That's what public interest tech is. And so I don't want voices like yours to feel uncomfortable when they say things. I want everyone to go, this is the voice we should all be listening to, and how come we're not? And so I look at the research grants, I look at where things are going in the world, and it's more of the same, Professor Wernimont. And I'm sort of at that same point as you going, when are we really going to see? When are we really going to start opening our mouths and saying, this has got to change? And we're using techniques like bells, which we should be. There should be a warning message. Come on, let's do this. Let's change things. Otherwise, we're just going to be one of the statistics in a different way, in a different time, in a different setting. Someone we love is going to be one of those statistics. And so what I love about you is that from the inside out, you're actually about your research. Your humanity is about your research. There's an authenticity that I think if we don't actually go to work as the authentic self, which I know as well, our wonderful student, a PhD candidate, Nikki Stevens, who I feel like calling doctor already, but Nikki Stevens does that in does that in their life. And so what are we going to do to change things? And this is what I hope this message of yours is.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Can you just stay online for a second and maybe stop screen sharing? I'm going to invite Erin.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you a story while Erin's setting up on her screen.
Yep, I'm all done.
Thank you. We don't want you to disappear for a second.
Nope.
This is another wonderful young voice in this space. And I turn up to the University of Wollongong to give a talk to early career researchers. I was invited back, Jackie. And I just chose to sit at a table. It was physical, but we had to have social distancing. And I just decided to sit on a table. And Erin walks in, I don't know, maybe 3 minutes later. And we have one of those conversations where I say to Erin, what do you do, Erin? Hi, my name's Katina. You know, she thought I was one of the early career researchers. And I said, oh, I do this. And, you know, and she said, this is what I do. And I said, wow, you did that? And it was like, yeah, like, why are you so interested in it? Because I love your research. Your research has to be prominently out there. And then she says, you know, Professor Wernimont? I said, yes. And that's her book. I'm buying her book. She bought her book the same day. But these are when voices come together, and we are not alone in this quest. I think the more we are authentic, the more we open our mouths and talk about things, the more we're going to find each other and actually find with the majority. We want change. And so with that introduction, I introduce to you Erin Twyford from the University of Wollongong and say thank you, Professor Wernimont, and thank you, Erin.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't find the unmute. Thank you so much, Professor Wernimont. That was absolutely incredible, and I have so much to think about, and it's actually really reinvigorated. I've had a bit of a tough week in academia this week, so I'm very excited to have something to go on with. So thank you so much to Katina for inviting me here today. I feel so honoured and privileged to be speaking with you all about my research. The title of my presentation is The Thanatopolitical State, Accounting and the Citizenry. But the sort of research that I do, I would say that I'm very interested in the way in which a state or states control and discipline the lives of their citizens through various apparatuses, including the practice of accounting, throughout their lives and into their death. And my research looks at this using the Holocaust as an extreme example of a thanatopolitical state. So I thought I would just start by looking at, well, what do you think accounting is? And for me, most people, when I talk, I say, I do accounting, I'm an accountant, and instantly their eyes glaze over and they're not so interested anymore. And they'll say, oh, okay, what did you do your thesis on? And when I start talking about the Holocaust and state control of citizen bodies, they start to get a little bit more interested. So I think that the dominant view out there of accounting is that it is this neutral, objective, disinterested, factual, reflective, in that it reflects through the numbers what is happening in reality. It's passive, it's just representing things numerically, and it's based on economic rationalism. When in fact, I believe anyway, it is the total opposite of that. I believe that accounting and the way that it counts things is biased, it's subjective, it is deeply involved in the meaning-making process. It's implicated in power relations. It's not reflective, it's constructive. It's not reflecting reality, it is actually constructing a reality. It is active. It doesn't represent reality. It will either conceal or at best partially represent reality, and it is ideologically driven. So there is a very pervasive and concealed role of accounting in facilitating state and citizen relations. So as a process of attributing financial values and rationales to a wide range of social practices, what accounting does, it can confer specific visibilities, calculability, operational utility, and for me, most importantly, and Professor Wernimont touched on this, silences. So the overall effect of silences hides the human element present in transactions, which serves to dehumanize, de-individualize, and degrade humans. Silences in accounting obscure the social, moral, ethical, and ultimately human elements that are so important. And the perpetration of such silences, I believe, requires exposure, which I attempt to do in my research by giving notion to the idea of a financial life. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But the idea is to give extra dimension to numbers through the integration of context and participants. So what is the hidden power of this outwardly passive, disinterested technology? So by making certain aspects of reality visible, accounting creates the possibility of controlling these elements. And it is this partiality in representation and its control potential which constitutes its real social influence, and in that, its social danger. So it's really important that we pay attention to the mutually constitutive nature of accounting, which means viewing it as much more than an instrumental or purely technical activity. In particular, as I've mentioned, accounting does not reproduce the visible, it renders visible. And this rendering has the impact of modifying human features that are not amenable to measurement and reporting in a numerical format. So in the Holocaust, this extended to making people invisible by ascribing them numbers and stripping them of their identity. So in looking past the numbers, I read a lot of survivor testimony, and one survivor stated, "We had no name, we were only a number. We were a labor unit, not people." And what this enabled was it meant the Nazis could avoid divulging the human correspondence of their accounts. The Jewish people were recognized no longer as a social being. They became invisible and ceased to exist as people. So in periods of human suffering, human accounting can be used as a tool, or what I would actually call a weapon, by the state to render the human side of reality invisible. So when we deny the intrinsic value of people through this dehumanized rhetoric of quantification, we maintain the dominant discourse that society or the people in power want to maintain. So accounting has its own inherent and silent power, which is produced and promoted by mainstream theorists and researchers, by practitioners, by users and standard setters who are maintaining that it's merely reflecting a factual reality. So this myth continues to legitimize the practice and use of accounting information at a political and economic level, while totally obscuring the social, moral, ethical, and ultimately human element, which shrouds the numbers in just this one-dimensional meaning. So conversely, where numbers are not provided, this indicates that that which is not captured by accounting must be without value. So accounting is, I believe, a social practice which is intimately linked to how humans structure and enact relations with each other within social and political communities. To the extent that these relations can always be structured differently, they're political choices, and accounting is political in precisely this sense. That which accounting counts and values is deemed worthwhile, while what accounting does not count is deemed to be of no value. So the consequence of this is that accounting is contributing to wrong ways of thinking by reducing all problems to economics, which masks the intrinsic worth of what is being measured, namely people's lives that are destroyed or being destroyed, which allows the perpetrators of death and destruction to rationalize their inhumanity in the name of economic growth, or, as I found in my research with the Holocaust, in the name of a political ideology. So policy can have life or death consequences for individuals, and this was particularly evident during the Holocaust, where human beings lost their distinctiveness as they were presented as this value-free measurement. And that non-value that was ascribed to that human experience, to their individuality, and to possibilities of emancipation excludes these elements from political and economic considerations. And where humanity then conflicts with the overarching goals of those in power, it can be devalued or removed from the gamut of information that is supplied by accounting. So I'm going to start then with the premise that accounting is not an instrument of mere calculation, description, and reflection, but it has consequences, most of which should be intended, otherwise it has no value as a practice or as a technology. So therefore, the use of accounting cannot be neutral or disinterested if it is to fulfill its mission. And this hidden power requires exposure. So by translating the values of the political and economic hegemony into the respected objectivity of an accounting representation, the invisibilities remain hidden and that which is not valued remains unimportant. So in conducting my research, I found I needed new theoretical tools in my toolkit to reconstruct how the use of accounting was used to mystify and mask the true nature of economic events, what was happening in corporations, what was happening in governmental transactions, where we see really complex issues just reduced to numbers. So to do this, I actually started with Michel Foucault and his idea of sovereign power, which is the idea that a state will try to make die certain members of the citizenry and allow or let the others live. And Foucault actually changed his thesis, and Professor Wernimont did touch on this when she mentioned biopolitics. So Foucault actually changed his views and said the inverse was actually what was happening, where a state was actively trying to make live certain members of the society while letting die others. And Foucault's work on biopolitics is a little bit unfinished because of his untimely death. So I went to the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who kind of took up this mantle, and he said, well, actually, what's happening is a bit of both. The state is actively trying to make live desirable members of the citizenry, while at the same time actively trying to make die or to kill undesirable members of the citizenry. And Agamben says that this can actually be achieved in a democratic state, which was what happened when the Nazis came to power. They were elected democratically, and their executive power was constitutionally enshrined. And he says that that is enabled through the opening of a space called the state of exception. So over 147 constitutions around the world have this provision where if a state is facing a real crisis, state of emergency, whether that's internally or externally, they are allowed to call that state of emergency, which basically suspends the constitution and gives executive power to whoever is in charge. So the Nazis did this. Their parliament was burnt down. They claimed it was a communist act. They called for a state of emergency, and so opened this peripheral space called the state of exception. And that state of exception is a place where you can put people, and they did. They started with communists, And whatever you do with people in that space is legal. If whatever violence you enact upon them is done so with impunity. And I just found that really interesting, that this was a space of legalized lawlessness, if you like, where human rights, where constitutional rights, everything was gone, and the state could deal with you how they liked. Now, Agamben also spoke about, well, how do we determine who goes in the state of exception and who gets to remain in the civil sphere? And he brought it back to some Aristotelian origins and the idea of Zoe and Vio. And apologies if I'm not saying that correctly. So Zoe is the life form that is common to all living organisms. So we are born, we reproduce, we survive, some of us, and we die. It's really base primal elements of living. And Aristotle and Agamben both say that the thing that differentiates humans from other microorganisms and other things that may possess Zoe is this idea of Vio, which is the ability to live a political life, the ability to be present in the polis. So when I came to do my research, I actually thought, you know what, there's another Vio. So now we have to call Aristotle and Agamben's Vio political Vio, or political life. And there's now a financial Vio, because humans have financial lives. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So then what I devised was the idea of a theoretical triptych based on these ideas of Foucault and Agamben. So in the first panel, so a triptych is a story told in 3 panels. So the first panel there is the loss within a thanatopolitical state of financial Vio, where the state is actively trying to make die your financial life. The second panel is your political Vio, so the state actively trying to kill your political life. And the final panel is the loss of Zoe, or the loss of existential life. So in demonstrating the utility of this triptych, I use the actions of the corporations Deutsche Bank, Ford Werk Motor Company, and Degussa as illustrative examples of how businesses deployed thanatopolitical state imperatives as concealed by silences in accounting and represented through counter accounts. So this was a question that was posed: how do we bring back the human element? And the way in which I've tried to do it is through the notion of a counter account, or an account that goes against what was accounted for. It kind of fills the gaps in the accounting reports to bring back the lived human experience as it fell outside the rhetoric of accounting, allowing the people who were placed in that state of exception, who were not deemed of value, to reinstate themselves as these major characters in the story of the Holocaust. So I believe that we needed to add this financial VO because it is quite different to a political VO. So citizen identity is often couched in terms of your labour or possession of capital and property. When we situate our place in the world or give an account of ourselves, we do not refer to our intrinsic values of political action often, because this is essentially beyond societal expectations. So when you meet someone for the first time, what do most people ask you? And they say, what do you do? So they are asking for an answer for you to account for yourself in an economic term. So for example, what job, what labour do you perform? Or they might ask, where do you live? Where are you from? And again, that has socioeconomic connotations. So what happens is our sense of self becomes shaped by a series of transactions that cheapen our identity to what Hannah Arendt would call economic men or economic people. So to bring the notion of political VO back to what I believe is its Aristotelian origins, I situated financial life as a means to a political life. So in modernity, we've seen a reversal of this process where a political life is a means to a financial life, but I just don't see that happening. And I think that the abject poor would agree that their life is politicized and they are not members of the polis because they don't possess that financial VO. So to achieve this, I posit that the notion of political VO actually is excluding the idea of financial or economic identity. And if we don't highlight the financial, we risk its disappearance into the political and its subsequent abandonment. If we can draw attention to financial VO, the often neglected financial persecution of citizens can be re-emphasised, which gives space for the role of accounting in such persecution to be further examined. So now we've established citizens have financial lives. The dominant mode of understanding these lives is accounting. And the often mundane expression of people's lives can be rendered unimportant among other social, political, and legal theorizations. So I was not surprised by the fact that Foucault and Agamben did not address accounting or the veiled power of it. So accounting operates surreptitiously, but nonetheless imparts human representation in accounting forms, which then can be used as a tool or a weapon apt for use by a state in implementing its policies. So accounting is intimately linked to the exercise of state power in that it is used by the state to operationalize abstract political objectives. Thus, we see accounting actually intervening into the private sphere and the private lives of citizens to deliver and enforce state directives, which can make live if you're desirable, or make die if you are not desirable, your financial VO. So I primarily looked at how businesses did this during the Holocaust. So Deutsche Bank was one such business that became an instrument for facilitating the loss of financial VO. What they deemed their administration of bank accounts was major business for them, where most of the true owners of the property were the murdered victims of the National Socialist genocide. So to give a brief contextual information, there were mass boycotts happening at this time for Jewish-owned businesses. There was a policy called Aryanization, which was basically the German state trying to exclude any sort of Jewish influence from the economic sphere. And this extended to laws that meant they couldn't work, which meant they couldn't earn money, which means that they were vulnerable, to not being allowed to have Jewish-owned businesses. So the Aryan businesses would come in and take over. So once they were depleted of the economic resources and the social privileges that these resources once provided, most Jewish people who had not escaped Nazi Germany were subjected to further exploitation and degradation. So this first panel of the triptych really emphasizes the notion that confiscation of wealth and seizure of property acts as an important catalyst in accelerating the downward spiral across the threshold to genocide and to further exercises of thanatos power. So I've got just a little excerpt from the Deutsche Bank annual report, and you can see down the bottom there that it bears the Nazi insignia. So in their annual reports, they made use of several techniques, including euphemism, or what was termed Nazi Deutsch rhetoric, and also just outright silences in their annual reports to conceal the nature of the transactions aimed at Jewish economic extermination. So they even altered the accounting to a form of Nazi Deutsch to obscure the true nature of events and transactions, which enabled both the state and Deutsche Bank to conceal their involvement in this eradication of financial VO. When I undertook a close reading of their annual reports, it revealed that Aryanizations were being disguised by being placed into an account which they called special items or one-off transactions, which was basically Nazi Deutsch for Aryanization-related activities, including the sale of securities, real estate, and brokerage fees. In the absence of Nazi Deutsch, Deutsche Bank simply remained silent on their role within the Aryanizations. So in examining their annual reports from the Nazi period of 1933 to 1944, only one report specifically mentioned details surrounding an Aryanization, where they stated, in Berlin, we've taken over the customers of the Bank Mendelssohn & Co. for our newly acquired business associates. The silence on any further details obscures several important things. First, that this takeover was in fact a forced Aryanization of a Jewish-owned banking firm. Second, that the Deutsche Bank had an active role in this Aryanization and was therefore complicit in denuding the Jewish owners of their financial VO. And third, that if the accounting had been made visible, it would have shown an acquisition far below its market value, which would have indicated political pressure. The Aryanization of other German banks was simply subsumed under that special items or one-off transactions account without any explanation, which concealed those exploitative acts of Deutsche Bank and thanatos political imperatives of the Nazi state. The account of those who were impacted by the Aryanizations was silenced because it fell outside of that sterile discourse of accounting. When I undertook further investigations into these Aryanizations, it revealed that while some of the non-Aryans who had been stripped of their financial VO had managed to immigrate, albeit in quite a destitute state, others were placed into concentration camps where very few survived. So this was all undertaken in a very democratic way. These were all laws that passed through German parliament, albeit under that state of exception. But many of the distinctive legislative instruments that were designed to rid the Jewish people of their financial VO later facilitated the removal of their political VO through denationalisation and restrictions on liberty. The revocation of political VO was primarily facilitated by the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which ensured that life and death were not properly scientific concepts, but rather political concepts. So without financial means and civil rights, Jews and other undesirables were forcibly placed into a range of camps, which were the state of exception, that space that exists within the state but outside of the state, and used as slave or forced labour. So Jewish slave labourers during the Holocaust were not treated even as productive assets. Rather, in most cases, these humans were treated as commodities to be used up in the production process. And this really differs from a lot of the literature that's done on accounting for slavery, where while abhorrent, they were treated as assets to be maintained. They wanted these people to live so they could continue to work. Whereas the slave labour produced during the Holocaust, they were never intended to live. It was a very quick turnover process. So many businesses actively embraced the use of slave labour because such labour was perceived as cheap and good for the bottom line. And these companies exhibited ambivalence towards the violence, degradation and starvation that was imposed on workers. So the loss of financial VO enabled through legislation established the conditions for complete exploitation by profit-driven companies such as Ford, which led to the loss of political VO. So Ford made use of foreign forced labourers, POW labour and slave labour from Buchenwald concentration camp, which was practising what they termed an extermination through labour program. So I have there an income statement which comes from Buchenwald. And for those who maybe are not familiar with accounting, our income statement tells us the revenue, how much money we've received, our expenses, how much we have paid to give us a net profit. Now, this outwardly appears like a normal income statement. However, it pertains to prisoners that were used as slave labourers. So we can see there the revenue. So that wasn't the money that the slave labourers received. That was the money the state received from these businesses for leasing out the slave labour. You can see there we have expenses such as clothing, food, a pittance. And then at the end, we see that net profit per prisoner. So the state was making the money from leasing out the slave labourers. We look a little bit deeper, we can see there the times are put on there too. Expected lifespan in months, 9 months was the expected lifespan for the slave labourers. So they were literally worked to death. We see there too, revenue at death. So that pertains to the fact that when these slave labourers were eventually killed through work, they sold their hair to fill mattresses and their body fat to make soap. So even upon death, the state was controlling the lives of these citizens and monetising them. Workers were differentiated into racial categories as mandated by the state, and these categories determined wages, conditions, food supplies, and the work to be performed. Inhumane treatment of labourers was encouraged by the Nazis as long as it was in accordance with those state-derived racial hierarchies, in order to separate the racial pedigree between the different workers. The foreign workers were exposed to varying levels of starvation depending on racial categorisation, as Ford was able to account for a large leeway to deduct for food and lodging, which of course never made it to the mouths of these prisoners. The payroll accountant at Ford testified soon after the war that after withdrawals for taxes, insurance, lodging and food, some workers received less than half the wages due to them under the regulations. And I'm talking here about forced labourers, not slave labourers, who of course never saw any money. So clearly the profit motive of Ford prevailed over the care of its workers, while concurrently supporting thanato-political imperatives towards the death of the Jewish people and other prisoners. So the dehumanisation of the workers was revealed primarily to me through testimony, as many survivors recall they were treated like animals or livestock. When not viewed as humans, they were not treated as such, which led to these acts of violence and exposure to death. Of all the degrading and horrific experiences of the forced labourers at Ford, the most common survivor testimony related to that de-individualisation and dehumanisation accorded through identification by number. Stripping people of their individuality and sense of self through legal instruments and Nazi actions designed to make invisible, brutalised the human experience. As one forced labourer recalls, we got numbers. We had a sign with a card. They hung that around our necks where we were all naked. And that was your entry number as a prisoner in Buchenwald. I had number 481756. You had to be able to read that in German and remember it, because constantly when you were in the camp later, you might be called for any reason. They called us by number, never by name. So from this illustration, an appreciation of the precarious nature of personal freedom and political life in instances where states implement a state of exception can be formed. Lost political VO as well as financial VO facilitated dehumanisation, which enabled inhumane treatment. Once the liberty, freedom and rights of these humans were stripped away, either by law or by the threat of violence, the next goal of the Thanata political state was extermination of Jewish and non-Aryan Zoe. So the final panel in the triptych relates to the loss of life experienced by over 6 million people during the Holocaust. And I wish there was a more visceral way that I could present that number. The loss was affected in a number of ways: poisoning in the gas chambers, execution through firing squads, starvation, death as a result of harsh conditions in the camp, death through labour, and even violence that was meted out as punishment or even amusement by guards, possible due to the prior removal of financial and political VO, which basically was a way of offering these financially and political dead people to the state of exception and the unfettered violence within. So, as was the case with Aryanisation and slave and forced labour practices, business decisions became life and death decisions. Mass gassings were devised as a way for the Nazis to deal with the genocide in a manner similar to production in a factory, that is, killing based on the detailed organisation and principle of the assembly line. Accountants were intimately part of this process, where they used a cost-benefit analysis to compare the cost of killing children with gas and then burning their bodies to the alternative of burning the children to death. 10 cents per child could be saved by the state in not gassing the children first. German pharmaceutical companies such as Degussa, through its subsidiary Degesch, produced that gas Zyklon B that was used directly in this assembly line of death, amounting to over 1 million dead in Auschwitz. Despite this fact, corporate officials denied knowledge of the use of the gas, noting that their job was to supply the Nazis as far as output and the allocations of the working committee allowed, and what they did with the substance was none of their business. So the state Thanata political imperative was facilitated by a very complex matrix of interrelated actors and practices that had horrific consequences for people. The defining condition that allowed for the operation of Thanata power and the pursuit of death in various forms was that suspension of civil rights in conjunction with supreme executive power, all constitutionally valid through the enactment of the state of exception. So within the broader socio-political legal context, accounting has largely escaped implication for its peripheral yet integral role in the death of citizens and the accounting for the death of citizens. So using this theoretical triptych has helped provide for me new understandings and render visible that which was previously concealed by accounting practices by examining those silences in the accounts and utilising subject testimony as a counter-account. So accounting as a social practice primes organisational systems, human behaviour and political action, all of which directly impact the lives of people. And the mobilisation of accounting during totalitarian, Thanata political or even democratic governments in this pursuit of Thanata politics can disguise the reality behind transactions and death in its financial, political and actual forms by using these one-dimensional integers which totally masks the amorality of such action. The numbers remain silent on so many things. Other states of exception, including war, political turmoil, natural disasters, and even pandemics, are of increasing concern. And I believe they require something like this new set of theoretical tools with which to recognise the implications of accounting. Because as long as accounting continues to operate clandestinely and insidiously, it can continue to reify power, state discipline of citizen bodies, and control over debt. So that's been my brief sort of introduction to my research. Thank you so much. I'm so privileged to be here. And if you would like to contact me further, I would be very happy to hear from you. My email is there, or you can follow my Twitter handle as well.
I can go, Katina.
Go ahead, Eusebia. Thank you.
Erin, it's a very interesting day today because I mentioned that I am professor of information systems, but I am in a business school. And the meeting I had before you guys was actually with accountants talking about auditing in AI. And I was talking about ethical algorithms too. So one of the questions that actually comes to my mind is this kind of discourse. It's almost impossible to see in a business school many times. And where are you able to share those, like to publish, for example, something like that? I would love to see that in accounting. We just published a military analysis of technology through accounting over the last 30 years. And guess what? On the 256 papers we analyzed, I would say 10 to 0 was the amount of work that was looking at accounting as with a other than an instrumental, technical, but actually a social created subject that actually has a social function. So what are your perceptions about that, and where can you have these discussions other than in this forum? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Look, there's not a huge amount. If you're comparing to traditional accounting research, we do have, and I say we, so there is a group of critical accounting scholars. There is space for us, but it is certainly not as, there aren't as many options as mainstream. So there are ways for us to get our research out, but I think our next challenge will actually be ways of getting our research beyond the critical accounting community, because we tend to just read those journals. So then, like, most people are going to go read a journal called Critical Perspectives on Accounting and be able to find this sort of information. So that's really our next step. I'm trying to think about, well, how can we have a bit more visibility in the social and public spaces? Because for me anyway, I believe the work we do is so important, and it needs to be there to sort of counter that mainstream view.
No, and I believe you have a humongous opportunity here, especially as accounting is being transformed and a lot of the decision making is being delegated to machines. So having that critical view and saying, hold on a second, look at the past, how this numbers were used, and even though the decision making becomes dehumanized by saying, well, we have this algorithm that improves 0.65% of performance, and off we go. So I think you have an amazing opportunity here. And to a certain extent, what I'm seeing in different communities of different areas of business, I think this pandemic has brought some level of consciousness that this focus on our research only on performance hasn't been very good. And we need to think further, what outcomes are coming from that, from the practices and that we do and so forth. So I'm looking forward to see what you're coming up with, because I think you have a wonderful pathway, especially looking into that, and especially when you look at the future of accounting. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think similar to what Professor Wernimont was saying too, we need these diverse disciplines to talk to each other, because otherwise we're missing parts of the picture and ways in which we can sort of move towards that better, more just society.
Erin, thank you so much. It's Katina. I am conscious of time, but I'm also conscious that there were a couple of questions. You're going to find as you're going through comments in response, I think a lot of us were really pinged by that 10 cents saving statement you made on one of the political losses and existential life losses. Toby, you had a question. I don't know if you want to ask it now quickly.
Yes, thank you. The question is really considering the origins of these technologies, whether it's the machines that are used to do these tabulations, whether it's the technology of accounting itself, the ledgers, the mortality bills that Jacqueline was talking about earlier. Can we redeem these things? Is there some redemption for the quantifying of humans that that leads us in a different place, or is it just that I'm Jewish, and in my tradition, like, we're told not to count people, right? We can count something as a substitute of people, but we can't count people. And with examples like you've shared, it really brings up the most negative end of the spectrum of what can happen when we count people. So into your understanding, is there a positive use of this kind of technology and approach?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. Look, I want to remain optimistic. I want to believe that there is a better path forward. I think that absolutely we can do it. Whether or not that gets co-opted by corporations in the way that environmental accounting has, I don't hold a lot of hope on that respect. But it would just be so great if we could get some sort of social accountants, right? So people that don't just do financial accounting, management accounting, but actually look at the social lives of people, and they don't quantify that, but they add to the other accounting information to make sure that we're getting more of a holistic view of what's happening in a transaction or an event, looking at the actual human elements, because at the end of the day, that's what we should be concerned about, not the monetary values, not the commoditization. We should be concerned about, well, what does this mean for people, and what can we do better for people? I would really hope that at some point we could move away from this idea that information that's useful for decision making, which is the whole premise of accounting, those decision makers are not just shareholders. If we could provide information and not based on the idea that the only people who care are the people who are either going to make money off it or not.
Thank you.
I hope so. I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Erin. I'm going to ask George Mickhail to get ready. Erin, George is well known to you. Professor George Mickhail is now at Bryant University in China. He is coming to us from Sydney, Australia for the time being. But George is a longtime friend, has been very supportive in the social implications of national security workshops that MG Michael and I hosted, where Dr. Roba Abbas was also a participant back in the mid-2000s. So George, the floor to you. I know you're the perfect person to summate the previous two talks, but also to really challenge us with some new ideas. So thank you, Erin, and over to you, George.
Thanks very much, Katina, and thank you very much to Erin and Jacqueline, because you're making my life a lot easier now with my presentation. And I'm going to just share my screen. Oops. This one, yeah. And here we are. It's very thought-provoking what we heard so far, because what it demonstrates that accounting is really a menace to social consciousness. That's how I read it and how I see it, because when you think about the use or abuse of accounting by accounting practice in particular, they're sort of like, they have a nation, they try to do things in a particular way. But I'm not going to talk too much about accounting, but I'm going to talk a bit about some of the ideas that I've been thinking about for the last few weeks, and there was an aha moment last weekend. So I thought I would share this with you. Maybe I was a bit spirited in doing that. But I hope you forgive me for any incoherence or any ideas that might be a bit underdeveloped. I'm going to start, my discussion will sort of like look at a certain timeline to help me just with my thoughts and bringing the ideas together. Fundamentally, for me, I see the world in terms of resource allocation, which is what accountants really do. We try to always allocate resources according to a little formula, basically, that is beneficial to the owners of capital or the people that are investing in the firm, which is the nature of being, so to speak. But this, of course, becomes a bit problematic when we start using that framework as a moral grounding to what we think, how we think the world should be. And we've seen the Great Depression hit, and of course, what we've seen there was, despite the highest, perhaps, unemployment, especially in the US, by comparison to other countries, especially in the West, capitalists at the beginning were, hell bent on, keeping their high prices and just, they would rather not sell their produce, etc. And then, of course, the government had to intervene because suddenly the government started to become a bit conscious that workers, farmers started to think socialism is sort of like is maybe more appealing. And that's when the government started to get in and started to, tax the rich, bring in pensions, unemployment benefits, insurance, etc. And in a way, of course, that was one of the responses to the Great Depression. There were 4 responses, which in a way shaped history, and our history really that we're even living today, because we're still reeling from that point in time, I think. Military dictatorships, of course, in Central America and Argentina, and that was, of course, because the West, industrialized West, was not able to buy the produce, and of course, drop in demand was problematic. And of course, social unrest means you get military juntas coming in to maintain the order. Fascism and militarism, we saw it in Germany, Italy, and Japan. And I don't need to go on about that. I think pretty much we are conscious of it, but it was interesting for me to know that, or at least get to know that actually Mussolini's rise actually happened even before the Depression. So you start thinking, okay, something is it something within the nature of the culture, or is it something beyond that, or is it just a function of the times? Japan, of course, invaded Manchuria and parts of coastal China in order they can relieve the impact of the Depression in Japan. And of course, Hitler thought, okay, I'm going to get in, no labor unions, restructures the industry and created sort of like monopolies. And his high military sort of like program, rearmament, meant there was almost no unemployment. Each of these, they dealt with the problem as they thought, if we think about it in accounting terms, they thought it was the way to be. And of course, there is, of course, a lot of underlying hate, underlying dehumanization of the other that comes in. And of course, we saw even that in totalitarian communism when it came in, and Stalin, of course, took advantage of it with his planned economy and industrialization and the sending people to the gulags during the Great Purge. And then welfare capitalism in France, UK, and Canada, which kind of eased things, and kind of these countries still sort of like calibrate this welfare capitalism to some extent. The Great Depression is important because it also made us realize that socialism was on the radar of the government, and government started to think, we need to do something about this. And in 1947, when the CIA was established, basically it was established to undermine the social system. So it was a bit of a propaganda sort of like machine for the government, if you think about it this way. I mean, I found it interesting that they actually went on to buy the rights to Animal Farm in order they can produce film where they would leave out the capitalist humans and just leaves the communist pigs in the film as a reflection of how bad communism was. And of course, in 1984, and that was, I think, in 1949 when George Orwell published 1984, suddenly we come across this new speak, which it's a language that was highlighted in his book as the language of the ruling party and so on. And we can kind of see that reflected a bit in today, even when you sort of like read sometimes newspapers and so on, you think, it's almost like you're reading the same repertoire, the same narrative, and then you think, is this a coincidence, or their use of certain terminology is intentional? And then, of course, in 1953, we started to see more of an engagement by the US, especially with the Muslim world, when Eisenhower invited Islamic luminaries to the White House. And then, of course, that was in July. And then in August, of course, there was the CIA Iran coup d'etat. And of course, you start thinking, okay, how is this going to evolve? And of course, the Iran coup d'etat was not the first coup d'etat, was not the only coup d'etat. It was almost like, because of the nature of its success, suddenly it became like a blueprint for other coup d'etats and, of course, other color revolutions that came afterwards. And the CIA, since then, were funding, of course, discreetly, national student associations, other people in other countries that might, be relied upon in terms of resistance and instigating a coup d'etat. And then we started to see there was a bit of a scandal, especially in 1967. And then about the CIA financing, basically, the National Student Association in the US. And of course, it came out. And it came out also that the CIA was also financing other people abroad. And of course, when you think about the real human cost associated with that, who innocently perhaps cooperated with the agency's front organizations, were tarred really with their CIA affiliation when the truth came out. And ultimately, I think the truth always comes out. In the 70s, we have this guy, a brilliant researcher, who joined the Center for International Affairs at Harvard. And he was invited by Schelling. Schelling was one of the people during the Cold War thinking about nonviolent ways to destabilize other countries and how to sort of like break the system from within. And he got a Department of Defense, I think, contract for funding for Gene Sharp. And Gene Sharp, of course, produced one of his famous, I think, books is From Dictatorship to Democracy, and the Sharp Dictionary of Power and Struggle. And basically came up with 198 non-violent methods and 997 glossary terms. When you look at these methods, you start thinking, I can kind of see that it's quite an interesting listing of things that we're kind of familiar with. We've seen it before. It's not unusual, especially, let's say, through unionism, through obviously resistance to by boycotting certain social events or social disobedience, etc., or withdrawal from social institutions. So these methods, he documented them in great detail, and his 997 glossary terms were brilliant because he kind of defined exactly what they mean. And I started to think, okay, and I remember seeing in our Australian Parliament House, politicians, whenever, let's say, someone from the opposition is talking, or the presiding government, let's say minister or prime minister, they used to turn their backs on one another. I started noticing that, I think, around the time of probably John Howard, sort of like late 90s, early 2000s. And it kind of, bugged me always. I thought to myself, what is that? And of course, sure enough, when I stumbled upon Gene Sharp's work, I realized that it's actually methods of nonviolent protest and persuasion. And of course, one of them, turning one's back, which is basically silent disapproval, emphasized by turning one's back, whether standing or sitting, to the person or persons who are or who represent the opponents. And then you start thinking, is that the way to run a government or our parliaments? I mean, it's almost like, when you don't allow someone to listen, if you don't listen to someone, don't allow them to talk, I think that's the worst things that can happen. And I remember years ago, we had this pompous foreign minister, Downer, and he used to always say, what you're saying is leftist, and I don't have to listen to this, and I don't have to answer this. And then you think, does that mean that anything that is going to be perceived of the left, or for that matter of the right, depending on who's the sitting government, we're not going to listen and debate issues just because they come from this side or that side, then what is going to be left to us? And of course, in the 80s, we saw neoliberalism sort of like, being pushed along by good old Reagan and Thatcher. And basically they, especially Reagan, decided to establish this National Endowment for Democracy, which was, of course, congressionally funded, and it was to promote democracy. And the idea was simple, really. It's basically they funded opposition groups against administrations that failed to adhere to neoliberalism or the US agenda. And of course, when you think about this net, you start realizing that much of its work that was done before was actually done by the CIA covertly. So this idea of high tax cuts, public servant cuts, deregulation, union busting, this is in essence what the neoliberalism is really about. And then, of course, the tech boom came in. So suddenly we inverted our methods of running our businesses. So instead of relying on lots of physical capital, working capital, etc., we started to move towards outsourcing our physical capital and working capital outside, get somebody else to do it if it costs them a lot cheaper than what it cost us. And of course, suddenly brand capital became king. And that's why perhaps you will find more students are going into marketing disciplines than perhaps, the old traditional disciplines. And of course, there is here, I'm going to go through this a bit quickly, and I don't want you to get too bogged down with the details, but fundamentally what happened with the resource allocation process, we started to see a degradation of human life because authentic, social, real life, so to speak, suddenly has been reduced. Accounting reduced it to having, which is basically the material exchanges of goods and services, and replaced it with its accounting representation. So suddenly you have the exchanges, and these exchanges between business to business, business to client, business to government, business to employee, into basically representations or contracts. And of course, by the end of everybody, engaging in an exchange and building on the previous exchange, suddenly the whole thing becomes almost mythical and separated from the real events. And of course, when you do that, then this transaction exchange, of course, is taking place on the stock market, which of course is required for capitalism to reproduce itself, because basically it's the events that take place in the marketplace, in the stock market, is what represents capitalism today, because it's basically this oscillation that is taking place, swinging between scarcity and abundance, like a pendulum. You're not even sure where sometimes you are. I mean, sometimes I listen to news and I think to myself, what are they really saying? And of course, once we have this oscillation, in essence, you suddenly retain no reference. You're not sure even where you are. You cannot really tell where you are. And of course, this means that even today, about even the reality of, the COVID thing, sometimes I listen to the news, I'm thinking, what are you saying? I mean, how bad is it, or how good is it? And you cannot really tell. And of course, part of that is to create this, I think, economy of fear and or a spectacle. It's a show, really. There is nothing really happening apart from a show. And of course, the more you get things happening quickly, and there is always movement and alternation, then you lose track of what's going on. And in a sense, our social consciousness, as some of you have already said earlier on, we're in a state of movement. We don't have time really to think about what happened, about the dead, about how many lives were lost, and it's scary. I mean, even at the beginning of the crisis, basically in the UK and here in Australia, they were talking about, okay, if somebody is old, so to speak, above a certain age, we don't need to give them priority of coming to the hospital. And of course, this spectacle of that we are witnessing, of course, increases our ontological insecurity, which of course fuels demand for security. And that's why everybody's, always almost super conscious about security. And no wonder security services, private ones, have dramatically sort of like increased. So tech boom, neoliberalism, and then of course 2001 hit, war on terror, and then nationalism, xenophobia, populism started to kick in, and then the neoconservatives thought, right, we need to do something about all this, aggression that is being expressed against us. And that's when they started to really engage in aggressive regime changes. And Jean Chan became, their poster boy, and he did a lot of works throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And I think in 2011, I think it was post, the GFC, that he started to revisit and rethink his ideas. And he started to think maybe actually neoliberalism is not really working, because his biggest problem was, the concentrated power of the state. Because he thought when you have a centralized state, it will create more, or it will inflict more terror, more tyranny, so to speak, on its citizens. But of course, what he didn't count on is the alternative, which is smaller groups, and how these groups can actually can create oligopolies and so on, like what we see in companies and monopolies. These groups are not necessarily going to provide more freedom and democracy, so to speak. And the other thing, of course, about neoliberalism is when you break down a system, you cannot really break down the military. The military is still in control, like what we've seen. I mean, the countries that gave way, the military always supported it, because the military colludes with, the business powers, the financiers, basically the financial backers within the country, and the other elites within the system. So the elites always kind of win from these kind of regime change revolutions, but the masses are not the main winners. And one of the things that I've noticed and perhaps prompted me to start kind of putting these things together was the idea of the anti-China rhetoric that has started to really become cognizant of, especially around 2015, 2014, 2015, I think. And of course, until our present day. And of course, I thought, why is this sudden, interest in China? Why is China now is the bad guy? And of course, I thought maybe it's the One Belt, One Road initiative, because the One Belt, One Road initiative, which was launched in October 2013, have suddenly become bigger than Ben-Hur. And I think the fear was it might export perhaps some of the Chinese characteristics. I'm in China, and I can tell you now, I'm not sure what is communism. I've not seen communism. And I see, sort of like neoliberalism on steroids there. And I'm thinking always, I just want to see, communism, where is it? And of course you start thinking, okay, maybe the geopolitical changes, having 138 countries joining the One Belt, One Road, I think was unsettling. So how to study this anti-China rhetoric was a bit of a challenge, because you have to read and go through different newspapers and so on. And I thought, maybe we can use a little bit of technology, scrape some of the websites, news websites, for relevant information to just a simple Excel table. And then for each entry in the Excel table, just search the text that matches the 198 methods of nonviolence action, or the 997 dictionary terms. So this means the actual text of each article would be scanned, and then I would assign, the method, as in the one from the 198 methods, or the dictionary item or term, to the Excel table entry that if I find it. So for every line, and maybe if I may just share something else on the screen here quickly. So for example, I downloaded all these articles that are kind of anti-China, so to speak. And then what I did was to look at the tables, and let me see if I have anything. No? Hang on. I think it's okay, title date. So we've got the methods, and then here, just one, just to illustrate that. So for example, the US recently, about 6 days ago, or 7 days ago now, decided to issue sanction warnings to the banks over Hong Kong crackdown. I must say I have not yet finished that sort of like little exercise, but I'm hoping that once I automate that process, then I'll be able to simply, build a social network and look at the authors and the media source and try to and link them to the methods or dictionary terms to identify sort of like who seems to be influencing our opinion. And of course, I don't want to do that now. That's not what I wanted. So the blacklisting of traders, as I said, it's number 93 on the list of methods. Suspension of social and sports activities, that's number 60. And that relates to some news, I think, yesterday. Today, 21st of October, about Australian Parliament to debate Beijing Olympics boycott. But what I want you to note here is where these publications are coming from. They're coming from an outfit called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And these guys have been really drumming up a lot of rhetoric anti-China. So I started to study them and trying to understand why they're doing that. And then, of course, the best way to study an event is look at the money. Who is providing the money? And there is a lot of money coming from the US, which you would expect, okay, that's expected because we collaborate a lot with the US. However, the other SP sponsors are the problem, which are the foreign weapons manufacturers. And this is just a simple sort of like social network of their connections. So you've got few weapons manufacturers from Australia, but these are mainly not Australian really companies, are sort of like a representative of foreign companies. So you've got companies from the US, of course, Israel, Germany, France, Sweden, Spain. And of course, you start thinking to yourself, why would foreign weapons manufacturers would be interested in sponsoring an Australian think tank staffed mainly by ex-defense and ex-intelligence personnel? And of course, would that maybe explain ASPI's hostile narrative about China to drum up a bit of business for its funding masters? And sure enough, over the last 2 years, ASPI has been basically putting proposals for which weapons we should be, as the Australian government, so to speak, should be investing in. And sure enough, the lion's share goes to their funding masters. And of course, the other thing is, why do we have this also, within a bigger picture? Why do we have this, narrative about especially Muslims in China? I mean, around campus where I am, there are lots of vegan restaurants, a lot of vegan people that keep their beards, they have their mosques and everything. I'm thinking, and then of course you read sometimes the news and you think, where are they getting this news from? And of course, the BRI Alliance today has got 138 countries comprising 51.7% of world GDP, but they have 4, which represent 4.8 billion people, 61.7% of the world population. And 1.4 billion out of these, so nearly 30%, identify as Muslim. And of course, this 1.4 billion represent or comprise 87.5% of the world Muslims. So what is the best way to torpedo this Belt and Road Alliance? Antagonize the Muslims. And of course, at the time when, governments like, when I say governments, I'm thinking more about right-wing neocons suddenly caring about Muslims. I start thinking that doesn't add up. And of course, I thought, okay, maybe it's just all about money. After all, this is my bias as an accounting researcher. And of course, I could be wrong. Let me see. Maybe not. And I think I'm going to stop here. And I'm happy to take your questions. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't go over.
No, George, I cut you short 10 minutes and you've nailed it now. I think we'll take 2 questions from the audience. What you've uncovered is pretty frightening, but I do know you're a deep thinker and you do understand strategy. You also know accounting. You taught accounting. You also taught information technology, so you know your stuff. Comments or reflections from people in the audience? We've got comments saying powerful work, George, and thank you in the chat window from a number of people. George, are you challenging us, of course, as always, to think where these sources are coming from?
I think, okay, we would be naive if we think, propaganda is unique to certain countries.
Mm-hmm.
We would be also naive that there are no financial interests. Okay, if you scare the bejesus out of a country like ours, we're a small country, we're a big continent, but small country. And then what? We're spending now about, 270 billion on weapons, mm-hmm. going to the same weapons manufacturers that are sponsoring some of our think tanks. And then mm-hmm. you start thinking, is there something wrong with this?
Mm-hmm.
To me, I don't believe that business interests are necessarily always in the national interest. That would be, I think, naive.
It reminds me of government-funded, non-government organizations.
Yes. So, okay, is it all just about good intentions? I don't know. I see the sort of like culprit here. And the culprit here, I think, is just great. If for the choice of a better word. And I think the other thing too is yes, geopolitically, China's rise is amazing. But the other things that I always think about it, I think, okay, I like to see results. I've been in Australia now about 30, 31 years. When I arrived in Australia, they were talking about this high-speed train. Today, they're still talking about it. 31 years ago, China didn't have any bloody high-speed trains. Today, we have it everywhere. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with us? China was poor, we were rich. What's wrong? Why are we just talking and not delivering, so to speak? And we see it in infrastructure, and it's always, we have more freedom and democracy. And you think, yes, but I'd like also practical things that would make my life easier. So when I'm on the train from Wollongong, as I used to go to Sydney and back, I don't spend 5 hours a day, So there is something not gelling, but I mean, I don't want to go into the bigger picture of the geopolitics of it, because it's still, I'm trying to find my way around it. It's not that clear, but I think it's predominantly about the money, a lot of it.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. I recently went on a podcast, George, where I spoke about one of the last projects I did in industry, which was after the bombing of Kabul. I was asked to go and do a high-level design back of the envelope for telecommunications mobile network. And I said, who are the competitors? They were all North American companies that were being represented to rebuild the place that the US, for political reasons, had done what it had done. And so it was a very uneasy kind of job for me to do, but it was the last one I did in industry. So, but it made me realize, inverted commas, war is good, because you need to build things and create machines and rebuild and other things of this nature. So in closing, I just want to thank the audience. I want to thank the logistics team, Cindy and Melissa, who've stayed on beyond the 15 minutes extra I asked for. And George, for you as a researcher, for being able to touch these topics in the public interest and to give us your analysis, sound in methodology, but also I think you're brave. You've always been brave and not always been appreciated where you've been. Because of this, I do think. But I also appreciate, given you're working in China, I worked in China for many years until very recently. And I think these reflections are healthy for us to talk about in the open. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Diana. Toby Shoref, thank you. Dr. Roba Abbas and everyone else I didn't get a chance to mention. People had to run to pick up their children from school on DC side. Thank you, George, and may everyone have a wonderful week. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time.
See you.